Good morning, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome all the media representatives who are currently in attendance at the Russia today, and I would very warm-heartedly welcome the guests and the panelists at this roundtable and all those who are watching this roundtable online. The topic is, are there stable relationship possible between Russia and NATO? As part of today's event, we will be introduced to a joint report by the Russian International Affairs Council and the European Leadership Network towards a more stable relationship between Russia and NATO. And with great pleasure, I would like to introduce our guests. Traditionally, from right to left, next to me is the person in charge of the European Security Department of the Russian Academy Institute of Europe, professor of the Moscow International Relations Institute, Dmitry Danilov. I am happy to see here the General Director of the Russia International Affairs Council, Andrey Kortunov. With great pleasure, I would like to greet our guest, the Director of the European Leadership Network, Thomson. Thank you very much, Mr. Thomson, for finding time to join us here today and participate in this roundtable, and her colleague, the expert of the ELN, Katarzyna Kubiak, the policy fellow on nuclear and arms control policy. So without wasting our time, let us begin this roundtable. Andrey Vadimovich, would you please introduce this joint report? What are the conclusions that you are arriving at? Thank you. I would like to begin with a quote of a well-known Italian thinker who many believe to be the father of political realism, Niccolò Machiavelli. And so he, at one point, said, hold your friends closer to you and the enemies even more closer. And so this principle, to hold your enemies closer to you than your friends, unfortunately, in as far as the NATO-Russia relationships are concerned, was broken. And very often we're saying, well, here we are. Unfortunately, our Western partners have frozen the work of the Council exactly during the point in time when there was such a strong need for this Council. It was exactly the way after the South Caucasian crisis in 2008. It also happened this way after the Ukrainian crisis in 2014. And now, for 5 years, we have been working not with a total lack of context, but rather with a very limited number of contexts. And I would say that it wouldn't be fair to accuse only our Western partners for that. For the sake of fairness, one should state that Russia was not very keen on maintaining such contacts. And an indicator of this is the fact that currently in Brussels we don't have Russian ambassador to NATO. After Alexander Grushko returned to Moscow, there was no person appointed in his stead. And I believe that this is the kind of circumstance was the main motive behind the report that here we are introducing to your attention. And let me state it right here and now that we are all quite lucky due to the fact that on the European side, the main author on the European side was Sir Adam, because Mr. Adam Thomson spent so many years being posted as the UK permanent representative to NATO, and I believe that there will be very few people found in the West who are so well knowledgeable of the mechanics of the NATO, who have a very good understanding of what's possible and what's not, what's real and what is unreal in as far as relationship with NATO are concerned. And so the report which we present to you today does not contain within itself any revolutionary ideas. These are quite modest proposals, and you may see that they have been split into two parts The first one is what can be done immediately, and primarily that is about reviving the dialogue, and the second part is about what could be done later on once the dialogue is back on its track and we can start moving forward. From my point of view, the value of the report is not in it having certain unexpected and paradoxical or innovative ideas, but in the fact that the ideas it has have passed through a lot of tests and reviews amongst the circles close to the decision-making levels, both in Russia and NATO. That is why we would dare state that these are very feasible proposals, even considering the current very complex political environment in Europe, and also thinking about objective differences existing between Russia and NATO. And to conclude, I would like to stress that this report is not about a transition from confrontation to cooperation between Russia and NATO. Unfortunately, there is still a long way for us to go. We mean to say that this inevitable contention and competition between NATO and Russia to be put into such a frame which would mitigate the escalation risks, which would downplay the risks of conflicts, so as to turn this situation into a more stable one for both parties. And this is certainly not to be considered as a favor from either NATO to Russia or from Russia to NATO. These are the ideas which we believe to be plausible and making a lot of sense, serving the interests of both sides. So, with all humility and modesty of its proposals, I do say that this report deserves attention, both from Russia as well as our Western counterparts. Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrey Vladimirovich. Very much, I believe these are modest but quite realistic ideas. Mr. Thomson, I would suggest that you should continue and also introduce this report as well. Thank you.
Indeed, and thank you for hosting us. We much appreciate it. We're extremely grateful to Andrey, Kortunov and his colleagues at the Russian International Affairs Council for partnering with us at the European Leadership Network. I need to stress that the European Leadership Network is a pan-European, independent, non-partisan, non-governmental organization. So despite my accent and my background, I am not representing any government or any particular side in the NATO-Russia confrontation. Rather, the European Leadership Network's focus, like the focus of this report, is on trying to reduce the risks in this confrontational relationship. Andrey Kortunov has described some of the report. In one respect, an important one, he is mistaken. It owes very little to me and almost everything to my colleague Katarzyna Kubiak, who has led the work on this report. And I would like to stress the amount of work that has gone into producing the recommendations that you find in this report. This has been a very serious effort. We have brought together very senior former NATO officials and former Russian officials on both sides, not just civilian, but also military, to consider the state of the confrontation. We have taken their ideas and we have tested them carefully not just at NATO, but in Moscow and in most of the major NATO capitals. And this has been a necessary activity because we are addressing an extremely serious issue. As the report says, the loss of trust since 2014 between Russia and NATO has been profound. We do not think it will easily be recovered. Instead, we face the prospect of many years of confrontation between powers who hold 97% of the world's nuclear weapons and who have a long history in the 20th century of confrontation. Moreover, it is clear from the work that we have done that the confrontation is not a stable one. There is less dialogue between the two sides now than there was during the later stages of the Cold War. And yet, good deterrence, effective deterrence of one side to the other, depends on a good understanding of the adversary. Arguably, the two sides understand each other less well than during the Cold War, certainly not well enough for this relationship to be safely managed. There is no set of crisis management mechanisms between NATO and Russia. The risks of unintended escalation in a crisis are much higher than is generally perceived in NATO capitals or perhaps here in Moscow. Those to whom we spoke in preparing this report, for the most part, believed that this state of affairs is actually dangerous. But you do not have to believe that the confrontation is dangerous for it to be rational to want to make it even safer. And that is why the recommendations that this collaboration between the Russian International Affairs Council and the European Leadership Network is important. The recommendations that you have in this report are very modest ones. Each of them builds on what is already happening. So the NATO-Russia Council meets. This report recommends that it should meet regularly. Russia has a delegation to NATO. This report recommends that it should be led by an ambassador. NATO and Russia each produce recommendations to the other side. This report recommends that both sides should try to improve the quality of the recommendations that they make, that the dialogue should be improved in substance. And it also recommends that communication should be extended beyond official contacts to contacts between non-governmental organizations in order to build a better foundation of mutual understanding about how to manage NATO-Russia confrontation. Underlying these specific recommendations, there are some very important broader points. One is that each side, both NATO and Russia, must stop regarding dialogue as a reward to the other side and must instead regard it as a self-interested tool in managing the relationship. A second is that each side must understand that communication with the other side is in its own interests and is not a reward of status. You do not have to recognize the validity of the other side's arguments for it to make sense to engage. And finally, these recommendations need to be understood not as an attempt to make the NATO-Russia relationship better, simply to make it safer. I will leave it there. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, господин.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomson. You noted Katarzyna's contribution into the preparation of this report, and I would like to ask her to somehow further extend on what you've just stated and make some key considerations that were reflected in this report. Katarzyna, please.
So maybe I would give you a short introduction of how we got where we got with the results in the report so that you have a better understanding of how we worked. Basically, we had 2 seminars in which we have invited high-level participants, altogether 17 Russian and 13 NATO representatives, who met once in Moscow in July last year and then in November last year in Brussels. During the first meeting, we were discussing factors which influence the instability of the NATO-Russia relation, but also escalatory elements of both military doctrines, threats which are involved in mutual deterrent signaling, as well as destabilizing elements of military deployments and new capabilities and military exercises. On the second meeting in Brussels, we have discussed non-kinetic threats to the NATO-Russia stability and explored areas of great interest and greater prospect for implementation. The high-level participants consisted of retired diplomats, former recently retired military personnel, former officials, think tankers, and academics. As Adam already mentioned, the European Leadership Network also explored consultations with experts and officials in London, Berlin, in Warsaw, as well as several NATO member states at NATO headquarters. As Andrey already rightly said, having the draft on the table, we have also consulted the draft version with a wide group of both Russian and NATO experts who supported our assessment of the current NATO-Russia relations and the dangers involved, and concluded that leaving the status quo in the relation is not sustainable for a stable solution. As has been already mentioned, we have 2 sets of recommendations. One of them we see as immediately possible and politically feasible. Adam already mentioned introducing a more stable agenda for NATO-Russia Council meetings, so making them either bi-monthly or quarterly. Ensure that Russian ambassadorial level representation is at the NATO headquarters, but also multiplying military-to-military channels, trying to develop a discussion channel not only between SACEUR and General Gerasimov, but also between the NATO Military Committee Chairman, Mr. Peach, and General Gerasimov. We also would suggest to utilize the existing NATO-Russia hotline to talk in case of serious cyber incidents, but also we see there is a wide homework both for Russia and NATO to do. NATO on its part is currently utilizing the don't make any business as usual with Russia as an excuse for not talking to Russia at all, and we believe that defining or at least trying to understand what this business as usual means could help to pave the way for discussion on issues which needs to be discussed with Russia. On the other side, we believe that Russia could strengthen the credibility of its dialogue offered towards NATO by engaging seriously and making constructive proposals which are not going to be disaccepted by NATO from scratch. There are also some smaller possibilities like non-military engagements involving, for example, a tabletop exercise to manage hazardous air incidents. There has been already a wide discussions trying to perceive civilian military air incidents. This time we would encourage a tabletop exercise looking at military activities, so between military air forces of Russia and NATO, and how to work through and how to manage possible accidents and incidents. But we would also encourage inviting experts to brief the NATO-Russia Council on issues like cyber, which is important to both sides. And I maybe will leave it here for your questions.
Да, спасибо большое.
Oh, yes, thank you very much. Yes, we'll come to the questions, but in the meantime, I would like to ask one of the most known Russian experts about Russia-NATO relationship, Dmitry Danilov. Dmitry Alexandrovich, the topic of our roundtable are stable relations between NATO and Russia possible. I suppose that you would respond affirmatively to this question, but what are the conditions against which this could be a possibility? Thank you very much for such a great commendation and introduction. Indeed, and as far as the NATO-Russia relationships are concerned, I've been professionally dealing with them for quite some time, and regrettably, at this point in time, these relationships are far from stability. If one is to understand under stability the strategic perspective of the way these relationships develop. Sir Adam before us said that the ambition of this report and its ideas are not about turning the NATO-Russia relationships into better ones, but in making them more predictable and safer. I think that this is true, and that was exactly the application in terms of the ultimate goal of this report. But I would rather say that the possibility of improving relations between NATO and Russia, I would not rule out as a perspective, because that is exactly the general goal of the long-term evolution of the positive development of the European security system and, generally speaking, Russia-Western relations. And I would believe that all such ideas should be targeting this general goal. And in this sense, on my part, I would like to add by saying that our goals should be ambitious. The NATO-Russian relationship should become better, be it not tomorrow or in the foreseeable future, but any ideas like that should fit this particular context. Now, about the stability of such relations, one may construe stability in different ways, and I would say that under stable relationships, one means the fact that these relationships should be developing within the strategic stability paradigm. However, in order, replying to the question what one needs for that, in order for this relationship to evolve in a stable manner, as a minimum, one has to have a stable dialogue. And here, from the very beginning, we have been having some serious problems. Since 2014, the original response from NATO to the Ukrainian events was quite clear. We were very well aware of the business-as-usual formula was impossible, but immediately, right after that, and including at this particular site, I'm very grateful to the Russia Today by continuously broaching this topic. The question was, if this particular usual business is not possible, then what kind of the business is possible? And so this transitional period in the relationship between NATO and Russia really took some time to continue when it became apparent that one should think about what one should need within the context of providing for the mutual deterrence within this current set of circumstances. But it was not clear in what way and for which particular purpose one should support, if not develop, the political dialogue. And so the next question which emerged and which was debated came down to a very simple notion. If one is to support the political dialogue, then what this should be? Should it be a political dialogue for the sake of a dialogue in order not to fall even further down, in order not to destroy the very last platform where it could continue, so that a minimum to continue communicating in such a cut format, or it was not sufficient anyway, and if it was not sufficient then we needed to have a dialogue aimed at a specific result. And so the expert community realized that it's a different matter, that it was very difficult to voice this in an official setup. And I'm very grateful to ALN and RIAC for the fact that such a very powerful forum was created for Track 2 for the expert consultations, which make it possible to issue the kind of recommendations which cannot but be accepted seriously by the official structures. I suppose this wouldn't have made any sense at all if not the way it came out. And I can refer to my own experience. Of course, you all understand that we have the ways to communicate with our official leaders and express some ideas in our publications. Over on the Russian side, I had the opportunity to communicate with the official people in NATO, but nevertheless, the capacity of such communication is quite limited. Our ideas do have some serious limitations. They may be in some way heard, but there is somehow no official reaction due to understandable reasons and restrictions. So this report here makes it possible to somehow shift this official stance towards where it is necessary to provide for the dialogue along many lines. So the situation is quite favorable. It seems to me from the environment around it, because it has become quite apparent. I mean, two things have become quite apparent. The too extended kind of a transitional period where both sides haven't yet formulated their vision about the way such a dialogue could be evolving, in what way one should collaborate, what kind of issues or business could be run jointly. So finding specific answers to these questions is not what we're seeing right now. So this has become a bit too delayed. And so the call for such proposals to surface is there. And these ideas and these proposals appeared in the right time. One also has to take into account a different thing. I mean, the fact that in December there is a new Jubilee NATO summit is planned, and I guess that there is still sufficient time left in order, as a minimum, within NATO to consider the ideas about how one should act on the second part of the deterrence defense. But not everything is so straightforward with the dialogue. And again, it seems to me that for the NATO officials and the NATO leadership, for the NATO member countries, it is necessary to clarify this position. I would like to underscore yet another thing which has been reflected in the report, It has been stated in it, but in a very diligent and accurate way. But I believe this to be a very important thing. What I mean is that if Russia and NATO don't start moving towards that, and Russia and individual NATO member countries would start looking for various opportunities to resolve these issues on bilateral issues, and that would pose a challenge both to Russia because, let me put it this way, leads to the multiplication of the political dialogue channels as well as the security dialogue channels. And one should say that these dialogues are sometimes very difficult to bring into balance, I mean, in terms of the different interests of the NATO member countries. And on the other hand, that would be also a challenge to NATO, which would cease, to a certain extent, acting as a forum to execute the national security policies of the member countries as a minimum in their relationship with Russia. I believe this is a very significant thing, a significant consideration. The call for such proposals is there. There is another very important point, the loss of credibility. We've discussed this particular topic a lot in the past, but we used to say that it was because of insufficient mutual trust. Now we're talking about the total loss of trust, and we're commenting by saying that it is highly unlikely that it would be recovered in the immediate future. It is correct, it is true, but on the other hand, in order for somehow even to think about building this trust again, it is necessary to develop a dialogue rather than just to keep up the fora for mutual briefings within the NATO-Russia Council. In order to think about some kind of rebuilding of this trust in the future, it is quite naturally impossible not to undo the bottlenecks in our practical interaction, because trust is impossible in an empty place. Trust is the result of communication based on interest. Let it be a selective kind of interaction to begin with, but it seems to me that this is something that we must be very much aware of. Another thing, Mr. Kortunov stated that this report doesn't contain revolutionary ideas. Yes, indeed, we don't want it to be perceived as some sort of revolution, but these ideas are revolutionary in a sense, still, because they have been devised in order to break up the currently existing unfavorable routine of interaction between NATO and Russia. And they do have a very comprehensive nature. They're not modest. They are significantly important because certainly we talk about acting in the principle of do not be detrimental in what you do. We don't want to scare off our official leadership, but simultaneously it seems to me that it is necessary on the one hand to demonstrate, and the report has it, to demonstrate the abnormality of the current status quo and the possibility to overcome it. Well, I believe that I would finish with that. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dmitry Alexandrovich. Will there be any further comments? Mr. Kortunov? Q&A? Yes, I believe yes. I mean, because we can talk a lot about very specific matters in the report, but I believe it really wouldn't be correct to dive into the technical aspects of our proposals. If there are any questions, I would rather have them. Yes, particularly since our colleagues have had an opportunity to briefly leaf through it. So, dear friends, you now have the opportunity to ask questions of our guests. Don't take your time, because there's not much time left. All right. Well, whilst you are thinking, let me start by raising the first question. Dmitry Alexandrovich and Andrey were saying that this intermission in the relationship between NATO and Russia is taking too much time, that the NATO-Russia Council no longer is being convened, and when there's so much need for it, because we're now having a lot of questions and issues which demand resolution. Mr. Thomson, so my question would go to you. Today, Russia, President signed the decree on Russia not anymore performing its commitments within the INF Treaty. Well, this is not really any big news, because the plans for Russia to stop its participation were announced on February 2nd as a response to the similar action on the part of the US. NATO expresses its concern about Russia's decision, but Russia is similarly concerned. In January this year, Russia tried to dispel the concern between the NATO countries, having staged an unprecedented presentation of the very same missile in question. But the military attaches of the alliance didn't attend it. All of them did not. And so Russia's position is the subject of criticism from the West and from the NATO countries, but somehow NATO countries are not being critical of the United States, because the decision to withdraw from this treaty was made by the United States. Why?
The detail I'm going to turn in a moment to my colleague Katarzyna Kubiak, who is the ELN's expert on INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. But let me make a more general comment. The fact that both the United States and Russia have suspended their participation in the INF Treaty is a reflection of a relationship between the West and Russia on security matters that is getting progressively worse. Both sides appear to believe that this is acceptable. If they must pursue a confrontation, including on matters concerning nuclear weapons, we would argue that they should also take steps to make that confrontation safer. And yet we have seen not only the INF Treaty violated by Russia, or as Russia believes, by the United States, but the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997 violated. Both sides allege that. We see more military presence by NATO on the NATO-Russia border and by Russia on the other side. So a gradual military buildup. On both sides, there is now military doctrine that requires very rapid reinforcement in a crisis, with a corresponding risk of misunderstanding by the other side unless that rapid reinforcement is carefully explained. And the INF example is just one example of a deepening sense of offense, of insult that each side feels from the other side. And yet it is concerning that neither NATO capitals nor apparently Moscow are paying very much attention to this. It is easy to understand that Russia feels it frustrating to engage or try to engage with NATO. It seems that there is so little prospect of movement. That is a profoundly unsatisfactory policy response to a situation of this gravity. And part of my message today is that Russian authorities need to try harder. They need to bring more credible proposals to the NATO-Russia Council, rather than proposals that are seen by the NATO side as basically sarcastic. Now, for INF, may I turn to Katarzyna?
Okay, thank you. Well, NATO allies from the beginning on have been supporting a diplomatic solution to the INF conundrum. However, neither of the NATO allies beyond the US is party to the treaty, and neither of them felt strong enough to intervene in this bilateral crisis between Russia and the US. Unfortunately, neither Russia nor the United States were willing to give enough transparency regarding the other side's allegations to the satisfaction of the other side. The United States required Russia to show the alleged missile, both in a test flight, in a way under the conditions the US would give to Russia, as well as having a glimpse into the system itself. Russia, on the other side, might have been interested in having a look into the ground-launched Mk-41 launcher, which is being used or going to be used for launching ballistic missile defense interceptors currently stationed in Romania and in the future also in Poland, to make sure that it cannot and is not going to launch offensive INF range missiles. President Putin's information of officially suspending the INF treaty yesterday only puts the clock further ticking towards August 2019, when the American withdrawal will enter into force. What we probably can expect now, or try to work towards, is to limit the fallout of the INF collapse. And what I mean by this is, on one hand, the North Atlantic Council could try to formalize its pledge, very often given by the NATO Secretary General, that NATO does not intend to deploy new nuclear missiles to Europe, and by doing so formalizing this pledge. On the other side, Russia could also make a reciprocal pledge not to deploy INF-range nuclear missiles in Europe. In the longer term, without the INF, we are going to see probably a demise of arms control. As of today, we do not see any activity towards extending the New START treaty, which is the only lasting agreement putting caps on strategic nuclear forces. And I believe that it's either time to keep the caps on strategic nuclear weapon systems by extending New START, or if Russia perceives that the New START is too much Obama legacy to raise Trump's interest in extending the treaty, it's time to actively make an offer for a new agreement. And as such, what President Putin said in his State of the Nation in February, that Russia is willing to participate in arms control, is a welcome statement. Less welcome is the second part, where he said that arms control talks are possible if Washington initiates the conversations. Russia, being one of the countries with the most nuclear weapons worldwide, definitely has the capacity and the authority to also come up with active ideas on how to further arms control in the future.
Спасибо. Андрей.
Thank you very much, Andrey Vladimirovich. Dmitry Alexandrovich, will you share with us what you think? Well, you know, speaking about the INF Treaty, seriously speaking, this is a bilateral treaty between US and Russia. And the military political NATO alliance does not have any direct relationship to it, but nevertheless, it is the European security which is at stake. Well, yes, certainly, I would say that European security would suffer most under the circumstances. And I suppose that it is in all of our interest to try and minimize these inevitable negative consequences of pulling out of this treaty for the sake of European security. I believe that in terms of the military and technical sense, it would be really great if both parties would commit themselves to stick to the status quo. On the side of the United States, such an idea was voiced to the extent that the US won't deploy the intermediate-range missiles in Europe. And generally speaking, politically it is not very easy, because additional consultations with the allies will be required. Technologically, I mean, there are different points of views about the extent to which the US is ready for such a deployment. But it is similarly important for Russia as well to demonstrate commendable restraint so as not to undertake the kind of steps which could principally alter the balance of forces in Europe. But I would allow myself to once again revisit the issue about the future relationships between Russia and NATO, so as to say that one of the problems is us considering such relationships in a very generalized, I would say, even mythological format. Just look, there was a lot written and spoken about the kind of negative consequences that the Montenegros joining NATO would have. Yes, and Russia was somehow accused of undertaking not to allow Montenegro to join NATO. Well, but nevertheless, you know, Montenegro is part of NATO, and it's Macedonia which is waiting for its turn. And we were saying that these actions change the security paradigm and has various threats. But I never saw anywhere any detailed professional analysis of the way this changes the European security landscape, and towards extent, generally speaking, the Montenegro's or Macedonia's accession to NATO strengthens NATO, because both of these countries are rather consumers than the producers of security. On the other hand, it is quite curious to observe the kind of debate currently going on in the NATO countries about the military-political cooperation between Russia and Turkey. Again, there is a bit of a mythical perception that is being bloated, saying that Turkish and Russian relationships undermine the NATO positions without any serious attention being paid to the issues within which Russia and Moscow and Ankara cooperate in Syria. And so I believe that in order for us to really understand what's going on, and as a consequence understand what needs to be done, we need to dispel these myths which exist on both sides, so as to cast a direct look at the true matters and problems. If we are capable of doing it, that will be a great step forward, and maybe then certain fears which we see in the West towards Russia, as well as in Russia towards the West, such fears would turn out to be pure phantoms, and it would be easier for us to move into the future once we bring all of these issues down to the surface. Well, do you mean to say that certain new rules of the game needs to be produced? Well, I think that somewhere, unfortunately, we need to go back to the rules that used to exist during the Cold War period. If we look at the stage of the mature Cold War, which is 1970s and 80s, here I say there are certain good things to pay attention to and where we can draw our experience, but one should understand that there's not going to be any second Cold War, because currently the situation both for Russia and NATO is of a principally different manner, even if one was able to revive the treaty on conventional forces in Europe. That really wouldn't be much help, because it restricts only 5 categories of weaponry. And over the past years, since its signing, the technical progress has changed so many things. So, going back to the positive experience, yes, which we had back in 1970s and 80s, we also need to take into account the new challenges. And so in the course of our discussions in Brussels, we paid particular attention to what in English is called, that's just strange phrase, which non-kinetic threats, which are the threats which are not related to traditional confrontation between the military, but rather the threats which exist outside of the framework of this confrontation, but nevertheless not less important, like the cyber threats, which are quite tangible both for us and NATO. So quite possibly this is the area where we could find certain points of interaction. But this is not the issue of the immediate future. This is the matter for a certain subsequent stage, as long as we are able to revive the dialogue between us in the format stated forth by this report. Yes, the question is certainly a very serious one, and one may discuss it at length, but generally speaking, really I enjoy hearing this question, why the European supported it. I'd say that it's one of the events, such events, quite interesting ones and high-level ones amongst the experts. I heard the following argument. When we were asking our European counterparts, well, what about the Russia's concerns? I mean, we're saying that the US budget has the program for the production exactly of the kind of the missile which falls under the INF treaty. The answer really surprised me. When the United States realized that Russia deceives them, that it has this kind of a missile which violates the treaty, the United States undertook the very last attempt, and it was the last signal from the United States about the seriousness of the US intentions. Well, you know, this kind of an argument simply is just bewildering. The Americans are serious people, and they never waste their money. And so such a very costly last signal, and I can hardly believe it. Now, why Europeans support it? It seems to me that this is a multi-aspect kind of issue, and there are so many responses to it, and one can reason at length. But let me share with you just a few of my ideas. The support of the United States by the Allies. Well, first of all, this is the support which was demonstrated within the paradigm of the conflict and confrontation with Russia. We all understand that in this sense, the position of the Western nations and the NATO nations in many ways demonstrates solidarity. And this solidarity is related to the need to deter Russia and to the understanding of Russia posing a strategic challenge, if not a threat. This is first thing. And that was why there was such a solidarity and integrated position within the alliance. I mean, we understand it, but you may recall other things. For example, the support at different levels for the US positions with respect to the very same chemical weapons application in Syria, when the United States just openly stated, it doesn't make a difference whether you support us militarily or not. We're going to attack Syria anyways. And so the British, together with the French, supported that attack. Well, you see, what we're talking about is and this is the second point I'm after, about the lack of the readiness of sorts on the part of many European US allies to contradict the Washington against the situation when such important issues are at stake as the strategic alliance, the support for transatlantic balances, and so on and so forth. So, in various surveys by the North Atlantic Council, in various articles, there's an open, study of the way the American mission came to Poland. Have they been able to confirm or not this strategic solidarity within the NATO, this collective commitment? And so various words and phrases are being analyzed and the rest of it. So, all the way down to the facial expressions. And so in this sense, to risk strategic balances, the transatlantic balances within NATO is something that hardly anybody would agree to. Apart from it all, one should not forget that Europe, the Europeans do have their own interests. The Europeans cannot agree with the United States on everything, and on a number of very serious issues they do disagree. One of the very important topics, the comprehensive Iran treaty, where the European Union and the Europeans took up the position different from the United States, but at the same time what comes up is where can one go in order to find the instruments in order to implement this different understanding of the situation, different from the US's one. So this issue of the tool set in order for their own political platforms to be executed, just imagine that in NATO they would say, we are against US pulling out of the INF treaty. So what? Where's the result? I mean, where's this tool set in order for this protest to be brought into reality? Yes, I mean, the Europeans are not in a position to influence what the United States do. On the other hand, such disagreements could create a certain critical mass, that is not needed neither by America nor Europe. And the last thing, effectively, I believe that everybody in Europe understood and used to understand for quite some time that this landscape, this really INF treaty has been lost. And to really win it back and try and have it as it used to be is something that no serious political figure would try to go for. So, I mean, there's nothing which surprises me here. But the different thing is what kind of conclusions we should come to. And there is some serious thing which is related to the way NATO interacts and will be continuing to develop its relationship with NATO on the basis of the American leadership and the transatlantic solidarity, or on the basis of such a leadership which transforms into the dominant one, limiting the Europeans in its capacity to seriously affect this general approach by the US. I mean, in Russia, you can be vocal about it, and some even revert to it in order to come out with some voguish statements in different talk shows. But the Europeans, specifically, are continuously emphasizing the fact that Russia exaggerates this lack of independence of the American NATO allies. It is stated that the European allies do have their own voice and that the decisions are being made in a collegiate and collective way. Yes, this is true, but the trends which we observe right now in terms of this shift in the transatlantic balances, I guess, are not being viewed as favorable by Russia if we are trying to look at the future of the NATO-Russia relationship. And so in this sense, if the US administration, the current administration, maybe the next administration will continue to instrumentalize NATO as the way to deal with Russia, Russia will have a very narrow kind of interest in having good relationship with the alliance. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, dear colleagues. Again, I would call upon the media representatives. If you have any questions, please raise your hands and introduce yourselves. Yes, the very last row. Arab Emirates Information Agency. The news came that sources in the U.S. State Department mentioned that the U.S. is ready to begin negotiations with Russia about the treaty as long as Russia guarantees that it would be possible to organize free joint verifications of various sites. Is Russia ready to go for that? My question is to Mr. Kortunov. Well, you know, it seems to me that there are two steps which Russia is not ready for. The first one, Russia is not ready to admit that it violated the INF treaty, and this is a principal position. I do not believe that the current leadership will step away from this stance. And so the missile that everyone has been talking about at length is the missile from the point of view of Russia, which is not in violation with the treaty. And certainly there will be difficulties. Now, second point, Speaking about verification measures, Russia is not ready to go for some unilateral measures. I mean, there cannot be a kind of an agreement that the United States will be granted access to Russia's launching pads in Kapustin Yar or somewhere else, and in exchange, they would ignore the kind of concerns which had been expressed towards the anti-missile systems and the launching sites which can be used to launch tomahawks. So principally speaking, if these two issues are alleviated, certain negotiations, I believe, are possible. But at the same time, I'd like to remind us yet again about the Russian president's position, which, as he stated, that we are not going to come forward with any new proposals, that all of the proposals which we wanted to announce are well known to the American side. They are on the table. So the move is now for the American side to make. And so if there are any new proposals, Russia would be keen to consider them. Thank you. Any more questions, dear colleagues? Yes, please. I'm sorry, there was a statement made by the Russian ambassador to the US, Anatoly Antonov, who said that Russia is undertaking certain reciprocal steps in exchange for the deployment of American missiles in Europe, meaning that Europe is now in the sights of the Russian launching pads. So what do you think about this? What is the European attitude towards such a statement? Thank you very much. Yes?
Addressed to me, the first thing to say, if this is indeed what Ambassador Antonov has said, is that there is currently no US or NATO plan to deploy additional US missiles in Europe. So there is no call for Russia to respond to such a development, and such statements, if they are made, will, I regret to say, be seen on the NATO side as yet another example of threatening Russian behavior that is unwarranted. It's just one more example of the way in which the dynamics of this confrontation drive a downward spiral. I should say it's very familiar to me because I was, once upon a time, the British ambassador at NATO. I think there's a set of further points to be made about INF as an example of confrontation specifically between Russia and the United States, but more generally between Russia and the West. It is that neither side is explaining their point of view very well, and both sides are behaving rather badly, perhaps because neither side is really very deeply interested in preserving this treaty. They are more interested in a trial of strength over it. Just to be concrete, I need to stress I am not privy to American information, but my understanding is that the Americans have film of the Russian missile in question flying a so-called racecourse track that has these missiles flying longer than the limit of 500 kilometers. And they have had this for many years, since at least 2014, when they have been trying to persuade Russia to engage. So the United States has long believed, and US allies in NATO have more recently come to believe, that Russia has a case to answer, and Russia is not answering that case. By the same token, it is not surprising that Russia should have concerns about US behavior in this general area. And Russian concern focuses, as my colleague Katarzyna has pointed out, on NATO ballistic missile defense systems in Eastern Europe. So in that sense, Andrey, NATO is implicated in this argument. NATO insists that this ballistic missile defense system is not directed against Russia, indeed physically cannot be directed against Russia. So it is a little difficult to explain why NATO finds it so difficult to allow enough transparency for Russia to satisfy Russian concerns and remove that issue from the table. As a matter of practical diplomacy, and I have been doing this for 40 years, if you want a deal, you usually have to give a little and not just take 100%.
Можно мне тоже два слова сказать?
I would like to say a couple of words as well, if I may. President Putin in his time said that we are going to respond to the American actions in a mirror-like way. Meaning to say that if the strategic environment in Europe changes, we would undertake steps in order to prevent any changes in the existing balance. And so now, as it seems to me, the issue is how the Russian military and the Russian political leadership perceives the process of the anti-ballistic missile defense being set up in Europe, in Romania and in Poland. If it is being viewed as something which is simply the reason to suspect that the US violate the treaty and does not necessarily mean any confidence in the fact that such a violation has indeed taken place, then Russia may afford not to undertake any serious responsive measures. Now, if the establishment of the anti-ballistic missile defense system is being considered as the fact of violation of the INF Treaty, then certain deployments of the new intermediate range missile systems in the European part of Russia most probably become inevitable. In the meantime, it seems to me, there exists a certain uncertainty, deliberate or undeliberate, by the Russian side in order to keep its hands free so as to be able to further respond to American activities. Just following on what Andrey just told us, just look the way it is all happening. The United States are saying that they have no intention to deploy any new missile systems in Europe after withdrawing from the treaty. Well, great. Russia, in this situation, what does it have to say? That it is not going to deploy such missiles in its territory. So how do you see that? I suppose that such statements, in any case, would not be serious. I mean, under such circumstances, even Russia's restraint would bear only a relative value, because at any point in time, Russia may be accused of behaving aggressively, deploying the missile here or there, developing a new missile of this or that sort, and so that could very well serve as the pretext to change the current position expressed by the United States about the lack of an intention to deploy the new missile systems in Europe. So this situation of the lack of confidence in the future, of the lack of mutual regulations, is something that is of much greater concern rather than 1, 2, 3, or 5 missiles are going to be deployed in Europe or not. Because this lack of certainty and the possibility of the escalation spiraling upwards very quickly in the course of a relatively short period of time, when this indeed could lead to a new crisis. Thank you. Any more questions, dear colleagues? No questions are no questions. All right. Then let us wrap up our today's discussions, which demonstrates how many problematic issues we have in our relationship. But let us hope that modest but firm steps to bring us together would eventually help us in finding the mutual answers. Yeah, when the first stage is done, we'll get together and we'll think what to do about the second. Well, in this case, let's move forward as fast as we can to complete the first stage. So all the best, and see you again. Thank you. Thank you.